Okay, so this is YouTube that's just supposed to introduce you to the papers that I posted up on SmartSite for Tuesday's lecture on monitoring, and we're talk about measuring conservation effectiveness. And this has been something that's really occupied the minds of the conservation organizations lately, and there's a lot that has been written and a lot of hand-wringing about results-based management. And I want to just guide you through those papers that I posted up so that you can kind of go through them quickly. I think I put five up there, and so it's a lot of reading, and I just want you to get the key points. So the first thing to think about is the lexicon of monitoring, that we can distinguish monitoring from surveillance. That surveillance is the idea that you might be counting stuff and assessing changes in population, but there's not necessarily any actionable threshold identified. That things go up, things go down, that's great. You're not committed to doing anything as a consequence of whatever you find. Whereas the people writing about monitoring now are suggesting that monitoring should really be pinned to actionable thresholds. What happens, what do you do as a consequence of a response variable crossing some threshold? That there should be some actionable criteria in order to call this monitoring. But then there's another set of terms that we can be thinking about in terms of monitoring. Some of it is really just process monitoring or compliance monitoring, that a grant is provided to an NGO to purchase some land. Did they purchase the land? Okay, fine, then they did. Or a contractor's been contracted to plant stuff in a wetlands restoration. Did they plant the stuff? So this is really just, did they fulfill the kind of contract? And this is a really very easy kind of monitoring. But we're going to be concerned with a more difficult kind of monitoring, and that's an outcome-based monitoring of conservation actions. How do we know that the implementations that you do on the ground are working? When do you stop doing something because you've decided it's not working as well as you want? These are very difficult problems. So a former student from Davis here, Matt Muir, who now works for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Washington, D.C., worked for the Conservation Measures Partnership for a while. In 2011, 10 and 11, there was a Conservation Measures Summit. One was in Palo Alto, and in preparation for that, Matt was contracted to assess whether we are actually measuring conservation effectiveness. And so he interviewed a whole lot of people from a lot of different NGOs and some agencies. The upper right box is the title of this paper. You can find it online. But here you see in figure 1 is sort of the nut of the problem, that we are somewhere between a 70-30 and a 90-10 split in terms of our resources paid in terms of money that's going for conservation that's not based on results-based monitoring, and 10 to 30% of the dollars are guided by results-based monitoring, and that's self-reported. On the right, you see that he interviewed people that reported on up to 7,000 projects that were being implemented. About 2,500 of them have conservation plans in place. Only 300 to 500 have completed an RBM cycle, meaning that they've monitored the outcomes of actions and use that to revise what they do. That's a pretty small number. You could think this is early days in this, but that's probably not the full answer. That we have trouble investing in figuring out whether what we did works when we feel so constrained by resources that we want to use those same resources to do more stuff. It's always this competition between doing more stuff and learning about whether the stuff we did worked. So here's the core hypothesis of adaptive management. So on the left is a very simplified version of adaptive management: plan, do, check, and adapt. So the idea is that you're checking on what you're doing and you're learning from that. That's what Holling's adaptive management was all about. Over on B, the argument is that if you're allocating resources as you are on the left, that you're going to have a relatively high failure rate, the gray part of the bar. Whereas if over on the right you invest in the blue part of the bar, investment in effectiveness management, then you can reduce failure rates and do better than you can. At least that's the hypothesis. These are figures from Matt Muir's paper, by the way. And this is perhaps the most sobering result he had. So he classified respondents into high to low frequency. Almost all projects do this. Some projects do this. Few do this. No projects do this. And you start on the left and you move over to the right, and you go from planning to doing to checking and adapting. And the language on 1 through 20, you can stop this and pause it and read those words, but they represent different steps in the process of doing results-based management. It includes scoping the project, getting partners, identifying who the partners are, including stakeholders, identifying the threats, etc. This is very much after the open standards. And you can see that many projects do the left side of it, and then when we get to do, again, most projects are doing stuff. They have a logic model, that's a 10. They develop an action plan, 11. They develop operational plans, that's 12, and they implement the operational plan, that's 13. Most projects do that. But then when you get down to check and adapt sorts of steps, the 14 through 20, you find that somewhere between some to few projects do this, that monitoring just isn't getting done. And so this has stimulated a whole bunch of academic work on why that might be so. One of the, I guess now slightly older ones, nearly 10 years old, 8 years old, Legg and Nagy wrote a paper about why most conservation monitoring is a waste of money but doesn't need to be. And they take a very sciencey approach. So box 1 and box 2 here are based on other papers, previous papers on conservation monitoring, and they talk about securing long-time funding and developing goals and refining objectives and training personnel and making sure you handle the data and peer review the data when you're done, etc. And then the thing that I'd like you to focus on for a moment is down in the lower right, which is barely legible. It's ways to increase power in monitoring. And this is very telling about this paper, is they're suggesting that a lot of the monitoring is bad science because we aren't thinking about the data enough. And so this is in that classic trichotomy that I've been wheeling out periodically through the quarter: better data analysis, better decisions based on the data. Legg and Nagy are far into the better data end. A paper that's also up there is by Sankiriko and other folks here at Davis, and it's early online with conservation biology. It'll be coming out soon. But we're looking at really the policy process in conservation monitoring and thinking about monitoring as a social process where stakeholders don't always necessarily have the same interest in seeing the outcomes of monitoring. And as a consequence, you can come to very different conclusions about how much you should invest in that monitoring. So, for example, the director of a land trust may get money to purchase a piece of property, and then the monitoring that person might want to have done is whether they purchased the piece of property, whereas the person who's ending up managing that might want to have substantially more monitoring being done. So there may be conflict internally within the conservation organization as to the monitoring, but it could get worse when you get to contentious issues such as fisheries management, when the stakeholders, the fishermen and conservationists and fisheries biologists all have a stake in the outcome, and may not necessarily have the same interest in the data. Okay. So I'm going to hurry up and finish this up. Lindenmayer and Likens proposed a sort of a decision tree to think about adaptive monitoring. Again, their points: we need better data, we need to analyze the data better. So in terms of that triumvirate of better data, better analysis, better decision making, they also focus on the better data and better analysis. And this is a figure from that paper that you can see. McDonald and Madden from the University of Queensland. Lindenmayer, by the way, is also in Australia. He's at the Australian National University. But McDonald and Madden, University of Queensland, they're big into this decision-making stuff. And here they have a decision tree about whether to monitor or not to monitor. And they argue a lot of times people are calling for monitoring when we don't really need to monitor, that we really are pretty certain what's going to be the outcome of monitoring. And you may or may not want to do that. And then, so finally, the last paper that's out there is this paper by Jim Sankiriko and the rest of us. And we're looking at a monitoring cycle that looks like this complicated figure down the bottom, but we're basically identifying the fact that there are different coalitions that are in charge of starting this monitoring cycle, and that we call on something called the Advocacy Coalition Framework, developed by Paul Sabatier, who was at UC Davis, and that stakeholders may see different value in monitoring information. Stakeholders may disagree on the action criteria given the data, and therefore it becomes very important to establish what those action thresholds are before you start monitoring, and that a lot of monitoring may fail simply because of this social process rather than bad data. And so what we're saying is that it really requires better decision-making processes associated with it. So those are the papers, and that's we're going to frame the conversation that we'll have for most of the time on Tuesday. I'll flesh this out, of course, for lecture on Tuesday, but please go through that material and think about those things in order to frame the discussion. And then we can talk a bit about, various things that we're all involved with, because, ostensibly you're conservation biologists, you're working on conservation things. Bring in your stories of how monitoring plays into the projects that you work on. Okay, great. Good luck. See you on Tuesday.